Everyone knows the story. The American Civil War was a noble tragedy. Brother against brother. A misunderstanding between two proud regions that simply could not agree on how the country should be run. The South fought for states' rights, the North fought for the Union, and somewhere in the background, almost as an afterthought, there was the question of slavery. That is the version many people carry in their heads. It is clean, it is tragic, it is comfortable. And large parts of it are a lie that was written on purpose, decades after the last shot was fired. But if you follow the money, the real story looks completely different. And it is far darker than a war about flags and pride. Let me tell you what actually happened. Not the version from the monuments, the version from the ledgers. Here is the first uncomfortable fact. In the year 1860, on the eve of the war, the single most valuable form of property in the entire United States was not land, it was not railroads, it was not factories or gold or ships, it was human beings. Stop and sit with that. Historians who have added up the numbers estimate that the roughly 4 million enslaved people in the American South were worth around $3 billion in 1860. $3 billion. In the money of that time. To understand how enormous that figure is, you have to compare it to everything else the country owned. That $3 billion was more than the combined value of every railroad in the United States. It was more than the combined value of every factory. It was more than all the banks. Enslaved human beings were, by dollar value, the largest single asset class in the American economy. Larger than the entire manufacturing sector of the North. So when people tell you the war was not really about slavery, ask them a simple question. If the most valuable property in the country, worth more than all the industry in the North combined, was suddenly under threat, do you really think the men who owned that property would let it go without a fight? Money does not surrender quietly. It never has. Now here is where the myth comes in, and it is important to understand exactly how the myth was built, because someone built it. On purpose. After the South lost the war, a story began to spread. It was pushed by former Confederate generals, by Southern writers, by veterans groups, and eventually by textbook committees. This story had a name. Historians call it the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause said something very specific. It said the war had never really been about slavery at all. It said the South had fought for a noble principle, the right of states to govern themselves. It said slavery was a dying institution that would have faded away on its own. It said the enslaved people were, in some grotesque retelling, content. It painted the Confederacy not as a system built to protect human bondage, but as a doomed and gallant underdog crushed by a bigger, greedier North. This is the myth. And it worked. It worked so well that a century and a half later, you can still hear pieces of it repeated at dinner tables and in comment sections. It works because it is comforting. It lets a nation avoid looking directly at the thing it did. But we are going to look directly at it. Because the men who seceded left us something inconvenient. They left us their own words. When the Southern states left the Union, several of them did not simply walk out in silence. They published official documents explaining exactly why they were leaving. These are called the Declarations of Causes. And they are not subtle. Mississippi published its declaration in 1861. In the second sentence, it stated plainly that its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, which it called the greatest material interest of the world. It did not hide this. It led with it. The men who wrote that document wanted the world to know that they were leaving to protect slavery, and they said so in the opening lines. South Carolina, the first state to secede, complained bitterly that northern states were refusing to return escaped enslaved people and were electing leaders hostile to slavery. Texas declared that it had joined the Union as a slaveholding state and denounced the idea that all men are created equal as a false doctrine. Georgia's declaration spent paragraph after paragraph on the economics and politics of slavery. These are not interpretations by modern professors. These are the primary sources, written by the secessionists themselves, in their own hands, at the moment of decision. And then there is the speech. In March of 1861, the Vice President of the Confederacy, a man named Alexander Stephens, stood up in Savannah, Georgia, and gave what became known as the Cornerstone Speech. In it, he described the foundation of the new Confederate government. He said that the old Union had been founded on the idea that all men are equal, and that this idea was wrong. He said the Confederacy was different. Its cornerstone, he said, rested upon the great truth that the enslavement of black people was their natural and normal condition. The cornerstone. His word, not mine. The Vice President of the Confederacy stood in public and announced that the entire foundation of his new country was slavery. So when the Lost Cause tells you the war was not about slavery, it is not offering an interpretation. It is contradicting the founders of the Confederacy to their faces. Now you might be asking a fair question. If the cause was so obvious, why does the money matter? Why follow the money at all if the men just told us what they wanted? Because the money explains something the speeches alone cannot. It explains the desperation. It explains why compromise after compromise failed. It explains why a group of men were willing to tear a country apart and send hundreds of thousands to die rather than accept a change to their economic system. And here is the part almost no one talks about. The money was not only in the South. We are trained to imagine a simple picture: a cruel slaveholding South and a clean industrial moral North. But that picture is also a comfort, and it is also not quite true, because Northern money was soaked in slavery too. The cotton grown by enslaved people in Mississippi and Alabama did not stay in the South. It flowed north. It flowed to the textile mills of New England, which spun it into cloth and made fortunes. It flowed to the docks and counting houses of New York City, which financed the whole trade, insured the ships, and lent the money that kept the plantations running. New York banks extended credit to plantation owners. New York merchants brokered the sale of cotton to Europe. Insurance companies, some of whose names still exist today, wrote policies on the lives of enslaved people, treating a human being as an asset to be insured against loss. The financial machinery of slavery had one end in a southern cotton field and the other end on Wall Street. This is why, when southern states began to secede, some of the loudest voices begging for compromise came not from southern planters, but from northern businessmen. The mayor of New York City at the time even floated the idea that the city itself should secede and become a free port, so that the lucrative cotton trade would not be interrupted by a war. Think about that. A northern politician so tied to the profits of slavery that he considered leaving the Union to protect them. Follow the money, and the clean line between a guilty South and an innocent North begins to blur. The truth is that an entire national economy had been built on top of human bondage, and pulling that foundation out threatened fortunes on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. So the real question of this series is not the tired one you have heard before. It is not, was the war about slavery or states' rights? That question is settled, and the secessionists settled it themselves. The real question is deeper and more disturbing. It is this: if slavery was the largest financial asset in the country, who exactly stood to gain, who stood to lose, and who spent the next 50 years rewriting the story to hide their tracks? That is what we are going to trace, dollar by dollar, name by name. To understand how this happened, you have to forget the monuments and the speeches for a moment. You have to stop looking at the flags, and you have to start looking at the numbers. Because in the years before the war, a small group of men held more wealth in human property than existed in any other form in the nation. And they were about to discover that a new president and a changing world threatened to make all of it worthless. Let us open the ledgers. I told you that enslaved people were worth around $3 billion in 1860. That number is so large it almost stops meaning anything. So let us break it down until it becomes real. The federal government of the United States in that same year had an annual budget of well under $100 million. The entire yearly spending of the national government was a small fraction of the value locked up in enslaved human beings. To put it plainly, the value of the enslaved population was many times larger than the government that was supposedly in charge of the whole country. Now think about a single enslaved person as a financial asset. On the eve of the war, a healthy enslaved field worker in the Deep South could be sold for somewhere between $800 and $2,000, depending on age, skill, and location. Skilled workers went for more. In the money of that time, a single human being often cost more than a small farm. So a plantation owner who held 50 enslaved people was not simply a farmer. On paper, he was sitting on tens of thousands of dollars in assets, at a time when most Americans would never see $1,000 in their lives. A large planter with 200 or 300 enslaved people was, by the standards of the era, extraordinarily rich, not because of his land, because of the people he claimed to own. This is the first thing you have to understand. In the American South, human beings were not just labor. They were capital. They were wealth you could count, mortgage, insure, and inherit. And here is where it gets darker. Because enslaved people were not only bought and sold, they were used as collateral. Let me explain what that means, because it is the hidden engine of the whole system. When a planter wanted to buy more land, or plant more cotton, or expand his operation, he needed credit. He needed to borrow money. And what did he offer the bank as security for that loan? The people he owned. A planter could walk into a bank or deal with a merchant and borrow against the value of the enslaved men, women, and children on his plantation. If he could not repay, the lender could seize those people and sell them. Human beings were the security behind an enormous web of loans. Their bodies were, quite literally, the foundation of Southern credit. Now follow that thread outward, because this is where the money leaves the South. Those loans did not come only from local Southern banks. The credit flowed from the great financial centers and above all from New York. New York was the beating heart of American finance even then. And New York's money was deeply, structurally tied to cotton. Here is how the machine worked. A planter grew cotton using enslaved labor. That cotton was shipped to New York or directly to Europe. New York merchants, called cotton factors, handled the sale. They advanced money to the planter before the crop was even sold, taking a cut at every stage. New York banks financed those advances. New York shipping firms carried the cotton. New York insurance companies insured the cargo, the ships, and in many cases the enslaved people themselves. Every step of that chain generated profit for someone in the North. The historian who follows the cotton finds that a huge share of the money did not stay in Mississippi. It ran up the coast to Wall Street and into the pockets of men who never owned a plantation in their lives. By some estimates, cotton made up well over half of all American exports in the years before the war. Half of everything the country sold to the world was this one crop, grown by enslaved hands. The prosperity of the entire nation, its trade balance, its credit standing in London and Paris, rested on that white fiber and the people forced to pick it. Now let us name some names, because vague talk of bankers is exactly how the truth gets hidden. Consider the firm of Brown Brothers, one of the most powerful merchant banking houses in the country, with deep roots in the cotton trade. Consider the many New York and New England textile fortunes built on cheap slave-grown cotton fed into their mills. Consider the insurance policies. Records indicate that companies which still exist today, or whose corporate descendants exist today, wrote life insurance policies on enslaved people, paying out to the enslaver if the person died. A human life reduced to a claim on a form. These were not fringe operations. These were pillars of respectable northern finance. The money was clean on the surface and soaked in blood underneath. And this is why the simple story falls apart. The comfortable version says the moral North fought the wicked South. But the ledgers show a national economy, North and South together, that had wired itself to human bondage at every level. The South owned the people. The North financed, shipped, insured, and manufactured the profits. Everyone at the top was making money. So what happens to a system like this when someone threatens to switch it off? That is the tension that built through the 1850s. Because the value of all this human capital depended on one thing above all else. It depended on the confidence that slavery would continue and that it would expand. Here is why expansion mattered so much, and it is a point most people miss. The price of an enslaved person was not fixed by their labor alone. It was driven up by demand for new cotton land in the West. Every time the country acquired new territory, planters dreamed of new plantations, and the demand for enslaved workers rose. Rising demand meant rising prices. Rising prices meant every planter's human assets grew more valuable on paper. Slavery was not a static institution quietly fading away, as the lost cause later claimed. It was a growth market. And like any growth market, it depended on the belief that it would keep growing. Now you can see the real fear. If slavery were confined, if it were blocked from expanding into the new Western territories, then demand would eventually stall. Prices would soften, and the largest asset class in America, that $3 billion in human capital, would begin to lose value. Loans backed by enslaved people would look shakier. The whole tower of Southern credit would start to wobble. This is the key to everything that followed. The fight over whether slavery could expand into the Western territories was not an abstract argument about principles. It was a fight over the future value of an enormous financial asset. It was, in the coldest possible terms, a fight to protect a portfolio. And the men who held that portfolio understood the stakes perfectly. When politicians in the North began to say that slavery must not spread into the new territories, Southern leaders did not hear a debate about morality. They heard a threat to the value of everything they owned. A wall around slavery meant a slow financial death, and no one holding $3 billion in assets accepts a slow death quietly. Records of the debates in Congress in the 1850s are full of this anxiety, even when it is dressed in the language of rights and honor. Underneath the speeches about liberty and constitutional principle sat a very concrete calculation. If slavery cannot grow, our wealth cannot grow, and eventually our wealth will collapse. This is the financial foundation of the war. Not tariffs, though tariffs were argued about. Not vague states' rights, though rights were invoked. The foundation was a colossal amount of money tied up in human beings, whose value depended entirely on slavery surviving and spreading, and a growing political movement in the North that threatened, however slowly, to cut off that growth. Everything else, every speech, every compromise, every crisis sits on top of that foundation. But a foundation of tension is not enough to start a war. Tension can smolder for years. Something has to light it. Some event, some decision, some person has to turn a slow financial fear into a sudden violent break. Tension does not start a war. A match does. By the 1850s, everything was in place. $3 billion in human capital. A credit system wired to the auction block. A growing fear that if slavery could not expand, the whole tower of Southern wealth would begin to crumble. The powder was dry. All it needed was a spark, and in a single decade, 3 sparks fell. A court decision, a small circle of men who wanted disunion and worked for it, and an election that a group of powerful Southerners decided they would rather destroy the country than accept. Let us take them one at a time, and let us name the people involved, because this is exactly the part the comfortable story leaves blank. Start with the court decision. In 1857, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a ruling in a case called Dred Scott versus Sanford. You may have heard the name. Most people know it was bad. Few people understand that it was, in financial terms, an attempt to lock in the value of slavery forever. Here is the story. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his enslaver into territories where slavery was banned. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that living on free soil had made him free. The case climbed all the way to the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice was a man named Roger Taney. Taney was from Maryland, a slaveholding state, and he came from a slaveholding family. When he wrote the decision, he did not simply rule against Dred Scott. He went much further than the case required. And that is the tell. Taney ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, could not be citizens of the United States and had no standing to sue in federal court. That alone was monstrous. But then he added the part that shook the country. He ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories at all. None. He declared that the earlier compromises, the ones that had kept slavery out of the northern territories, were unconstitutional. Think about what that meant in financial terms. The fear was that slavery would be walled off, blocked from expanding, and that its value would slowly collapse. Taney's decision tried to tear down that wall permanently. He was saying that no law, anywhere, could stop slavery from spreading into the Western territories. For the men holding that $3 billion in human capital, this was not just a legal victory. It was a guarantee on their investment, signed by the highest court in the land. It said the growth market would keep growing, protected by the Constitution itself. But here is the twist that makes Dred Scott so important. Instead of settling the question, it enraged the North. Northerners who had never been abolitionists suddenly realized that the slave system did not intend to stay in the South. It intended to expand everywhere, into every territory, protected by a court they could not overrule. Ordinary Northern farmers and workers who wanted the Western lands for free labor saw the door being kicked open for slavery to follow them west. So the decision meant to protect the value of slavery forever, instead convinced millions of Northerners that the system had to be stopped. It was a financial insurance policy that backfired into a political explosion. Now to the second spark. The people. Because wars are not started by abstract forces, they are started by men who make choices. There was a group in the South, a relatively small circle, that historians call the Fire Eaters. These were not moderate planters hoping to keep the peace. They were radicals who wanted secession, who had wanted it for years, and who worked deliberately to bring it about. Names matter here. Consider Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina, a wealthy planter and newspaper owner who used his paper to push disunion relentlessly. Consider William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama, a fiery orator who traveled and spoke and organized for secession. Consider Edmund Ruffin of Virginia, an old man so devoted to the Southern cause that he reportedly fired one of the first shots at Fort Sumter, and years later, when the Confederacy collapsed, took his own life rather than live under the restored Union. These men were not passive products of their time. They were agitators with a plan. And notice who they were: planters, newspaper owners, men of property and standing, deeply embedded in the slave economy. The people pushing hardest for the break were the people with the most human capital to protect. The Fire Eaters understood something the moderates did not want to face. As long as the South stayed in the Union, there was always a risk that the political tide would turn against slavery. A hostile president, a hostile Congress, a hostile court in some future year could threaten the whole system. The only way to make slavery permanently safe was to leave, to build a new nation whose entire foundation, as Alexander Stephens would later say out loud, was slavery itself. So this small circle of powerful men spent years preparing the ground, writing, speaking, organizing, waiting for the right trigger. They needed an event that would frighten and unite the South enough to make secession possible. And in 1860, that event arrived. The third spark: an election. The election of 1860 brought forward a candidate from the new Republican Party, a tall, awkward lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Now here is a fact that the myth conveniently forgets. Lincoln, in 1860, was not promising to abolish slavery in the states where it already existed. He said repeatedly that he had no intention and no power to do so. What Lincoln and his party stood for was narrower, but to the men with the money, it was fatal. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. He wanted to build that wall, the very wall that Dred Scott had tried to tear down. And you already know what a wall around slavery meant. It meant the growth market stopping. It meant human capital slowly losing value. It meant the long, quiet financial death that Southern planters feared more than anything. So when Lincoln won the election in November of 1860, without carrying a single Southern state, the Fire Eaters got exactly the trigger they had waited for. They did not wait to see what Lincoln would actually do. They did not wait for a single hostile law to be passed. The mere fact of his election was enough. South Carolina seceded in December of 1860, before Lincoln had even taken office. Others followed within weeks: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. 7 states gone before the new president had spent a single day in power. Notice the speed, notice the pattern. The men with the most to lose financially did not wait. They struck first. The moment the political winds threatened their assets, they moved to break the country apart on the mere possibility of future loss. And here is the detail that reveals the calculation underneath the honor and the flags. When these states left, they did not speak in vague terms about culture or pride. As we saw, they published declarations naming slavery as the cause. Their new Confederate Constitution went further than the old United States Constitution ever had. It explicitly protected slavery. It forbade any law that would impair the right of property in enslaved people. They wrote their financial interest directly into their founding document, in ink, for all time. They were not being coy. They were protecting the portfolio, and they said so. So step back and see the whole machine now. A financial system built on human beings as capital. A deep fear that walling off slavery would destroy that capital's value. A court decision that tried to guarantee the value forever and instead enraged the North. a small circle of wealthy radicals who wanted out and worked for years to make it happen, and an election that gave them the trigger they needed to convince the wider South to follow. 3 sparks, 1 powder keg, and a war that would kill more Americans than any conflict before or since. But wars are not paid for by the men who start them. The fire eaters, the planters, the New York financiers, they made the decisions. They protected their interests. And then the bill came due, and it was paid by someone else entirely. The men who started the war did not fight it. Remember who made the decisions: the wealthy planters, the fire eaters with their newspapers and their speeches, the financiers in New York who profited from every bale of cotton. They set the machine in motion to protect their fortunes. And then, as always happens, the bill was handed to people who had no say in any of it. Let us count what they paid. Start with the raw number of the dead, because it is almost impossible to comprehend. For a long time, historians estimated that around 620,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. More recent studies suggest the true figure may be closer to 750,000. Either way, it is staggering. To understand the scale, compare it to the size of the country. The United States in 1860 had a population of around 31 million people. So the war killed roughly 2 out of every 100 Americans alive. 2% of the entire nation gone. Now translate that forward so it lands. If a war killed the same share of Americans today, the death toll would run into the millions. Millions of dead young men. That is what the country went through. That is the size of the wound. And here is the cruelty inside the number. The men who died were overwhelmingly not the men who owned the enslaved people. They were not the planters sitting on $3 billion in human capital. They were poor. There was a phrase that spread through the ranks during the war, on both sides. Soldiers called it a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And it was not just bitter grumbling, it was quite precisely true. Look at how the armies were filled. In the South, the Confederacy passed conscription laws to force men into service. But those laws contained a detail that tells you everything. Under one provision, a man who owned 20 or more enslaved people could be exempted from the draft. 20 enslaved people, the exact class of large planters who had pushed hardest for the war, were handed a legal path to stay home. Read that again. The men whose fortunes the war was meant to protect could, in many cases, avoid fighting it. Meanwhile, the small farmer down the road, who owned no enslaved people at all, was marched to the front. The soldiers noticed. The resentment was real, and it was loud. Ordinary Southern men began to ask why they were bleeding to protect the human property of men richer than they would ever be. Desertion climbed. In parts of the South, poor whites actively resisted the Confederate government they were supposedly fighting for. The North had its own version of the same injustice. The Union also turned to conscription, and its draft law allowed a man to escape service in 2 ways. He could pay a commutation fee of $300, or he could hire a substitute to go in his place. $300 was close to a year's wages for a working man. So the rule was simple. If you had money, you could buy your way out of the war. If you did not, you went. This sparked fury. In 1863, New York City exploded into what became known as the draft riots. Working-class men, many of them poor immigrants, rose up against a system that let the wealthy buy their safety while the poor were forced to fight. The riots turned dark and ugly, with mobs also turning their rage against black residents of the city. It was a horror layered on a horror. But at its root was a simple, burning grievance. The rich could pay to live. The poor had to die. So on both sides, North and South, the pattern held. The war was designed by the wealthy and paid for in the bodies of the poor. Now let us leave the battlefield and look at the home front, because the dying was not only in uniform. As the war ground on, the South began to starve. The Union Navy blockaded southern ports, choking off trade. The cotton that had made the planters rich could no longer be sold abroad. Meanwhile, the armies consumed food, men and animals at a terrifying rate. Prices spiraled out of control. Confederate money, printed in enormous quantities to pay for the war, collapsed in value. This is inflation, and it is a quiet thief. It means the money in an ordinary family's hands buys less and less each week, until it buys almost nothing. By the later years of the war, Prices in the South had risen so high that basic food was beyond the reach of many families. A barrel of flour that once cost a few dollars could cost dozens, then hundreds, in the worthless currency. In 1863, in the Confederate capital of Richmond, the hunger boiled over. A crowd, made up largely of women, gathered and then marched through the streets demanding food. It became known as the Bread Riot. These were not radicals or agitators. They were mothers and wives whose children were going hungry while the war swallowed everything. They broke into shops and seized bread and goods. The authorities threatened to fire on them to disperse the crowd. Picture that scene. In the capital of the Confederacy, the government that had gone to war to protect the wealth of planters was now threatening to shoot starving women who only wanted to feed their children. That is the price. That is what it looked like on the ground. And through all of this, remember the 4 million people at the very bottom of the whole structure. The enslaved men, women, and children whose bodies were the collateral for the entire system. The war was fought over their status, over whether they could be bought, sold, and moved west like cargo. Yet in the official story of brave generals and noble sacrifice, they are so often reduced to a footnote. They were not a footnote. They were the entire point. The war existed because a nation had built its wealth on owning them and could not agree on whether to keep doing it. And when the war finally cracked the system open, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people did not wait to be freed. They freed themselves. They walked off plantations. They crossed into Union lines. Around 180,000 black men served in the Union forces, many of them formerly enslaved, fighting for their own liberation while facing extra brutality if captured. So let us line up the accounts, the way any honest investigation must. On one side of the ledger, the profits. For decades, planters had grown rich on human capital. New York financiers, shippers, and insurers had grown rich servicing the trade. Textile fortunes had been built on slave-grown cotton. A small class of men, North and South, had made enormous money from the system. On the other side of the ledger, the costs. 750,000 dead, cities burned, a generation of young men crippled or destroyed, poor farmers ruined, working families starved, immigrants rioting against a draft they could not buy their way out of, women marching for bread, and 4 million enslaved people who had endured the whole thing from underneath. The profits went to the few. The costs went to the many. That is the true shape of this war, and it is the shape the comfortable story is built to hide. Because here is the question that should be burning in your mind by now. If all of this is true, if the primary sources say it, if the money says it, if the declarations and the speeches and the ledgers all point the same way, then why do so many people still believe the myth? Why are we still taught in so many places that it was really about tariffs, or states' rights, or a vague clash of cultures? That did not happen by accident. Someone worked very hard, for a very long time, to make sure the real story was buried. They built monuments, they rewrote textbooks, they shaped what generations of children were taught. And they did it for reasons that, once again, come back to money, power, and the need to avoid guilt. The South lost the war. Then it set out to win the story. This is the part the myth works hardest to hide, because it is the part where you can see the myth being built with your own eyes. The false version of the Civil War did not grow naturally out of confusion. It was designed, funded, organized, written into schoolbooks and carved into stone. And it was done deliberately by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Let us follow this money and this effort the same way we followed everything else. Begin at the moment of defeat. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. Its cause was destroyed, its cities burned, its economy in ruins, its central institution, slavery, abolished. The men who had led it faced a terrible problem. How do you live with having started the bloodiest war in your nation's history, killed 750,000 people, and lost, all in defense of human bondage? You do not admit that. Instead, you change the story. Almost immediately, former Confederate leaders and writers began constructing a new version of events. One of the earliest and most influential was a Virginia journalist named Edward Pollard, who published a book in 1866 with a title that gave the movement its name. He called it The Lost Cause. In it, and in the flood of writing that followed, the outlines of the myth took shape. The myth had a few core claims, and I want you to see them clearly because pieces of them still float around today. First, that the war was not really about slavery. It was about states' rights, about constitutional principle, about the noble defense of a way of life. Second, that slavery had been a benign, almost gentle institution, and that enslaved people had been content and loyal. Third, that the Confederate cause had been heroic and righteous, its generals almost saintly, its soldiers gallant underdogs overwhelmed only by the North's greater numbers and industry. Every one of these claims collapses against the evidence we have already examined. The declarations of secession name slavery. The Cornerstone Speech names slavery. The ledgers name slavery. But the lost cause was never meant to survive contact with evidence. It was meant to comfort and to control. Now here is the crucial question. Who did the work of spreading it? Because a myth does not install itself in the minds of millions of children. Someone has to put it there. The single most powerful engine of the lost cause was an organization founded in 1894 called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Understand what this group did, because it is remarkable and it is chilling. This was not a fringe society. It grew into a large, well-organized, well-funded network of women across the South, many of them from prominent families. And they took on a specific mission. They set out to control how the war was remembered, and above all, how it was taught. They went after the school books directly. The organization reviewed textbooks and campaigned to have any book removed from Southern schools that told the truth about slavery and secession. They pressured publishers. They lobbied school boards. They drew up lists of approved and forbidden texts. A book that called the Confederacy's cause what it was could be branded unfair to the South and driven out of the classroom. A book that echoed the lost cause was welcomed in. Think about the power in that. For generations, the history that Southern children learned about their own country was shaped by an organization whose explicit purpose was to defend the Confederacy's honor. The textbook on the child's desk had been vetted to make sure it told the comfortable lie. This is how a myth becomes common sense. You catch people when they are young, and you make sure they never hear anything else. And then there was the stone, the monuments. Most people assume the Confederate statues that stand in town squares across the South were put up right after the war by grieving communities honoring their dead. That is not what the timeline shows. Studies of when these monuments were actually built reveal something very different. Relatively few went up in the years right after the war. Instead, there were two great waves of monument building. The first and largest wave came decades later, roughly from the 1890s into the 1920s. The second, smaller wave came in the 1950s and 60s. Now look at what else was happening in those exact periods, because the timing is the confession. The first great wave of monuments coincided with the era when white Southern governments were stripping away the rights that Black Americans had gained after the war. This was the period when segregation laws were being locked into place and Black citizens were being pushed out of political life across the South. The monuments went up not as simple grief, but as markers of who held power. They were statements planted in the center of town, announcing whose version of history ruled. The second wave in the 1950s and 60s lines up with the civil rights movement. As Black Americans marched for equality, a new burst of Confederate monument building and flag raising appeared, a defiant answer to demands for change. So the monuments were not neutral memorials frozen at the moment of the war. They were political tools raised at the very moments when white supremacy was being challenged or enforced. They were the lost cause written in bronze and marble, placed where everyone would have to walk past it. Now step back and ask the investigators' question. Who benefited from all this? Why go to such enormous effort to bury the truth? The answer runs in two directions, and both come back to power. For the white South, the lost cause did essential work. It let a defeated society hold on to its pride and its sense of righteousness. But more than that, it justified the system that replaced slavery. If the war had never really been about slavery, if enslaved people had been content, if the old order had been noble, then the effort to keep Black Southerners subordinate after the war could be dressed up as the defense of a fine tradition rather than the continuation of an injustice. The myth about the past was a tool for controlling the present. For the North, there was a quieter benefit: reconciliation. As the decades passed, White Americans North and South wanted to come back together, to shake hands over the graves and call it a shared tragedy. But true reconciliation would have required the North to insist on the full truth and to protect the freedom of the people the war had liberated. That was hard. It was expensive. It made enemies. It was far easier to accept a soft, sentimental version in which both sides had been brave and the ugly matter of slavery could be quietly set aside. So the North, to a large degree, let the myth stand. It looked away while the Southern story was written into the schoolbooks and carved into the squares. The reunion of white America was purchased at the price of the truth and at the price of the very people the war had freed. And this is why the myth was so durable. It served too many interests at once. It comforted the losers. It excused the ongoing injustice. It smoothed the reunion of the country. Almost everyone with power found it convenient. The only people it betrayed were the dead, the enslaved, and the truth itself, and none of them had a lobby. For more than a century, this false history held its grip. It shaped textbooks, films, and popular memory. Generations grew up genuinely believing that the war had been about tariffs or abstract rights, that slavery was incidental, that the Confederacy had been noble, not because they were foolish, but because a determined, organized, well-funded effort had spent decades making sure that was the only story they ever heard. Only in more recent times have historians, working carefully back through the primary sources, the declarations, the speeches, the ledgers, the monument timelines, forced the true story back into the light. And even now, the myth fights on in corners of the culture, because myths that serve power do not die easily. So that is how the lie was built, deliberately, by named organizations, for reasons of money, power, and comfort. But you might be thinking that all of this is history. Old statues, old textbooks, old arguments about a war that ended a very long time ago. Why should any of it matter to you right now in your own life? It matters more than you think, because the deepest lesson of this whole story is not about the 1860s at all. It is about a pattern of how wealth protects itself, how ordinary people pay the price, and how the powerful rewrite the story afterward so that it never looks like their fault. And that pattern did not end in 1865. It is running right now, in the news you will read today. We have followed the money all the way through. Now let us bring it home. Over this story, we uncovered a pattern. It has 4 steps, and I want you to hold them in your mind, because once you see them, you will start seeing them everywhere. Step 1. Something enormously valuable becomes the foundation of an economy. In our story, it was human beings, $3 billion of them, the largest asset class in the country. Step 2. When that value is threatened, the people who hold it do not compromise. They fight, and they fight first, because they have the most to lose. The planters and the fire eaters did not wait for a single law to pass. The mere election of Lincoln was enough. Step 3. The cost of that fight is pushed downward onto people who never profited from the asset in the first place. Poor farmers, immigrant workers, starving families, 750,000 dead, a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Step 4. Afterward, the story is rewritten so that none of it looks like the fault of the powerful. The lost cause turned a war for human property into a noble tragedy about states' rights and installed that lie in schoolbooks for a century. Value at the top, fear at the top, costs at the bottom. Then a story to hide the whole thing. That is the machine, and here is the uncomfortable truth. The machine did not stop running in 1865, it only changed its clothing. Let me show you what I mean, carefully, because this is where you have to think clearly and not just feel. The specific horror of the Civil War, owning human beings as property, was abolished. That was a real and permanent victory, and nothing I say now takes away from it. But the deeper pattern, the way concentrated wealth defends itself and pushes the cost onto everyone else, that survived. It always finds a new form. Think about how often you hear that something is too important to be allowed to fail. When a large enough financial institution gets into trouble, the argument appears almost instantly. If it collapses, they say, it will take the whole economy down with it. So it must be protected. It must be rescued. Notice the shape of that argument. It is the same shape as the defense of slavery's value. An asset has become so central, so entangled in the credit of the whole system, that the powerful insist it cannot be allowed to lose its value, whatever the cost to everyone else. In 1857, the Supreme Court tried to guarantee the value of human property forever. The logic of protecting a threatened fortune and passing the risk to the public is not a relic. It is a permanent temptation of concentrated wealth. Think about who pays when a crisis hits. In the Civil War, the men who could exempt themselves from the draft stayed home while the poor went to die. In our own time, ask yourself, when a financial crisis strikes, whose fortunes tend to be shielded first, and who absorbs the job losses, the lost savings, the years of hardship? The names and the mechanisms are different. The direction the cost flows is often the same. Down, and think about the stories we are told afterward. Every major crisis produces a comfortable version of events, one that tends to spread the blame everywhere and pin it on no one powerful in particular. It was a perfect storm. Nobody could have seen it coming. Mistakes were made. These phrases are the lost cause of our own age, softer and quieter, but doing the same work. They exist to make sure that when the dust settles, the machine can keep running and no one at the top has to answer for it. I am not telling you that any modern event is the same as slavery. It is not, and the comparison would be obscene. What I am telling you is that the method of seeing through the myth is the same. Follow the money. Ask who held the valuable thing. Ask who moved first to protect it. Ask who paid the price. And ask who wrote the story afterward, and what that story conveniently leaves out. That is the real gift of studying this war honestly. It is not a collection of dates and battles. It is a lens. Once you learn to hold events up to that light, the official story of almost anything, then and now, becomes something you can question instead of simply swallow. Because here is the thing the powerful have always understood, and hoped you would not. The version of history you carry in your head shapes what you will accept in the present. If you believe the Civil War was a vague, blameless tragedy, you will more easily accept that today's crises are vague and blameless too. But if you have seen, with your own eyes, how a real story was buried and a false one installed on purpose, then you become much harder to fool. You start asking who benefits. You start following the money. And a person who does that is very difficult to lie to. That is the lesson. Not cynicism. Clarity. The ability to look at any grand, comfortable, official story and ask the one question that cuts through everything. Who profited and who paid? So let me leave you with three things. First, I want to hear from you, and I want a real answer, not a vague one. Think about the men who pushed the South into war, the wealthy planters and the fire-eaters who agitated for years. Here is the question. Do you think those men knew exactly what they were doing, coldly protecting their fortunes at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives? Or do you think they were, in the end, just products of their time and their system, swept along by forces bigger than themselves? Comment below. Type "knew" if you think they understood the game they were playing. Type "swept" if you think they were prisoners of their era. I read the replies and I want to see where you land. Second, if this changed the way you see this war, send it to one person. Specifically, send it to someone who still says the Civil War was really about states' rights, or tariffs, or anything other than what the men who started it said it was. Do not argue with them, just send them this. Let the primary sources, their own declarations, their own speeches, their own ledgers, do the work. It might change how they see not only the past, but everything happening around them right now. And third, here is what is coming next. We spent this series proving that the men who defended slavery knew exactly what it was worth and lied about it afterward. Next time, I am going to show you the financiers. Because while the South owned the people, it was the money in the North that made the whole system run, and that has been even better at hiding its tracks. I am going to walk you through the New York banks, the insurers, and the merchant houses that grew rich on slave-grown cotton, and show you how their fortunes, and in some cases their very corporate descendants, survived the war and carried that wealth forward long after abolition. The men in grey got the monuments, the men in the counting houses got to keep the money and got to be forgotten. Next time, we drag them back into the light, because once you learn to follow the money through history, you cannot stop, and you should not want to. Subscribe so you are here when we open those books.